After months of quiet, Baghdad's Tahrir Square came alive on Sunday to commemorate the one-year anniversary of Iraq's anti-government protests. Students and teachers who had previously marched to Tahrir every Sunday but had stayed away because of the coronavirus pandemic once again joined in. The atmosphere was part festive, part somber. They rejoiced to the beat of the same revolutionary songs of last year, but also remembered those who died for the cause.
This year, we are commemorating the youth who have died. After all this time, they still haven't done anything for us. We don't have the homeland we asked for. To get it seems impossible. But what we want right now is our rights, and the rights of the protesters who died.
Protesters climbed atop the barricades leading to the heavily fortified green zone, which houses government offices, taunting a ruling class they see as corrupt. Last year, they forced then Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi to resign, but the parties and the system that brought him to power remain in place.
This constitution doesn't represent us. It's a constitution that suits them, because they wrote it to serve their interests, these rich people who have hotels, commissions and millions, while we are here starving.
But the movement has been plagued by disunity and a lack of organization. Most protesters advocated for peaceful demonstrations.
The revolutionaries agreed to make this a peaceful protest without escalation, and they are voicing their demands in a peaceful way.
But others decided to cross the barricades to the green zone in an attempt to lay siege to parliament. Riot police used tear gas to repel them, resulting in several light injuries. A government spokesman said dozens of security forces were also injured when demonstrators threw stones, petrol bombs and homemade hand grenades.
All
of the security forces present on the three barricades and atop the buildings didn't carry firearms. The instructions were very clear and frank, and until this moment there is high commitment from the side of the security forces to protect the protesters.
The Prime Minister has called for early elections in June next year, but many protesters feel the government hasn't done enough to meet their demands for sweeping reforms. Sunday's demonstrations were to some extent a test for the protest movement to see if it could once again mobilize crowds. And while it was the biggest gathering in months, the numbers were not what they used to be last year. What remains to be seen whether the protest movement can once again galvanize support in the days to come. Simona Foltin, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
Well, last year's protests in Iraq were the largest anti-government movement since the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. It was Tahrir Square in the capital that really became the epicenter for these developments. Hundreds of thousands demonstrated, demanding a change in the way Iraq is run. They accused their leaders of corruption, lack of jobs, and being too close to Iran. At least 600 protesters were killed and thousands more injured in the months of unrest. The movement lost momentum and then came to a halt because of restrictions around the coronavirus. But it did force the resignation of the country's Prime Minister, Adel Abdel Mahdi, in November. Iraq's new leaders, however, have yet to deliver major reforms in a country where the World Bank says 1 in 3 people are unemployed. Well, Renad Mansour is a senior research fellow in the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. He joins us over Skype from London. And so, Renad, can you give us some, put what we've seen today into some perspective for us? We're speaking about corruption in the country, the protests that started last year, and of course, the economic situation and unemployment. Is it mainly young people who are still turning out to demonstrate?
Yeah, I think very clearly when you look at the images and who we're speaking to as well throughout the south of Iraq and Baghdad, it is the young people. It's these many different movements in the squares who are coming out to show their force, but also to say that they may have dwindled over the last few months, but that they are still there and that they are not happy with what the government has done so far. So while they managed to get, in their eyes, the Prime Minister to resign, they're still showing the new Prime Minister, as well as the government, that that's not enough. They're focusing on accountability, they're focusing on corruption, and of course they're focusing on better jobs and services. You know, over 50% of Iraqis are under 25 years old. These are kids who don't remember anything before 2003, All they know is the system that was imposed on them after 2003.
So these are calls that we're seeing for essentially a better quality of life and for the government to deliver on basic services. What about efforts to discredit these protests?
Yeah, and that has been something that the elite, specific groups, particularly in this elite, have focused on. These are not the first times we've seen protests in Iraq. In fact, many times since 2003, there have been protests. But in the past, the elite, the leaders, I mean, have been able to kind of, either through economics, i.e. giving more jobs, giving people more employment, or through ideology, using terrorism, Ba'athism, sectarianism, they've been able to kind of manage protests. These protests, the elite have no answer to. They can't use either ideology or buy them off in that way because, as it was said, the economy is on the brink in Iraq, and the people are tired of the same political parties and the misgovernance. This is a population that has been traumatized after 17 years of misgovernance, and they won't just take it. And so they're calling for accountability. They're calling for things that the elite cannot give them because doing that would have to undermine the whole system. They're calling this a revolution. They want the end to that system. So it's on the brink, and there isn't really a negotiating point there. There's no mutually hurting stalemate, as it were, to get them together in that way. So the only thing the prime minister is left with is calling for this early election. But in Iraq, we've had many elections, we've had many electoral law reforms, but we haven't changed the same political parties put in power after 2003 from spreading and sort of dividing up these spoils of that war.